Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mikowski, and I'm joined tonight by not just one Kevin, but two. Like I have a power couple of Kevins with me, Kevin Donovan and Kevin Pawlak. How are you tonight, fellas?
Right?
Doing
Happy to.
great, thanks. How about you?
I'm doing well, thank you very much. Excited to be talking about Fitz John Kevin. I mean Fitz John Porter, right? I've try to work him in there. So we're going to talk a little bit tonight about his mishap at Second Manassas and the ensuing controversy that forever clouded his career. And it seems to me most people, if they know anything about Fitz John Porter, it's they know he got court-martialed. Kevin, who is this guy? Kevin Donovan, who is this guy?
Well, he started as a very important United States general. The other Kevin, Kevin Pawlak, refers to him as the Forrest Gump of 1861 because just like Forrest Gump, he popped up everywhere. He played a very important role in some of the earliest events of the war. But by the spring of 1862, he also has emerged as one of the Union's top combat commanders. He's a corps commander, Fifth Corps. He is a protege, a favorite of George McClellan on the peninsula. And McClellan loves him, urges his promotion, sending praise about Porter and dispatches back to Washington. The man's star, as of, say, July of 1862, is on the rise. And who knows where he might have ended up in the pantheon of U.S. heroes of the war if his career had continued on that trajectory. But as we're going to talk about tonight, spoiler alert, it didn't.
Oh my gosh, I didn't.
I gave it away by his greatest victory. He effectively led the Army of the Potomac on July 1, 1862, at the Battle of Malvern Hill. And literally 5 months later, he is in the dock of a court-martial. Not only his career, but actually his life is at risk through the court-martial.
And he does some great work at Gaines's Mill, even though the Union Army loses that battle. I mean, he prevents the army from being destroyed as he very carefully executes that rearguard action and then pulls himself out. Kevin Pollak, what else would you like to add about who this guy is, Fitz John Porter?
Boy, he's a complicated character, certainly. Fitz John Porter is, as Kevin mentioned, but he really is somebody that's everywhere, and I think really is somebody that, for many of his faults, which he does have many, there's no doubt about it, is somebody that was, I think, an excellent military officer. He served in many different capacities prior to the Civil War, serving in the Utah War. He was on Albert Sidney Johnson's staff during that. He was a professor at the United States Military Academy at West Point. He pops up everywhere in 1860-61. He's inspecting forts in Charleston Harbor in November 1860 and suggest a replacement of the commander there, which leads to Robert Anderson then taking command. And of course, he's going to play a major role in the events in Charleston Harbor in late 1860, early 1861. He's involved in helping to get federal troops out of Texas during the secession winter. He goes out to St. Louis, Missouri, and is responsible, in essence, for getting Nathaniel Lyon in charge out there, which, of course, is going to have huge repercussions for the federal efforts west of the Mississippi River. He serves as Robert.
Perhaps
What's that?
not. Perhaps doesn't work out so well for Nathaniel Lyon, I
No,
suppose.
well, that's fair. Good, fair point. Yes, that's very true. He will serve as Robert Patterson's chief of staff in the Valley Campaign of 1861. So Porter's everywhere, and his star was, I think, always on the rise from the time he graduated from West Point in 1845, and so he quickly caught the attention of George McClellan when he was brought east to take command of the Army of the Potomac in the aftermath of First Manassas and was given a division. Fitz John Porter was, that is, and was somebody who was beloved by his troops. One soldier in the 13th New York talked about how strict of a disciplinarian Porter was, and often we think that soldiers did not like that. But despite his strict personality on the battlefield and on the drill field, this soldier said that even though Porter was such a strict disciplinarian, that's how he put it 3 times, that he would go and he would go to charge the gates of hell for that man and would give his life fighting under FitzJohn Porter's command. So I think that says a lot about Porter's character and how the soldiers that served under him And many of them that served with him, though, of course, as we'll get to, not all of the men who served with him thought highly of him.
Now, Kevin Donovan had mentioned a second ago that he eventually rises to corps commander as commander of the Fifth Corps, but Kevin Pawlak, uh, the Fifth Corps is kind of this odd creation that McClellan conjures up, and so when Porter gets that job, maybe it doesn't turn out to be the plum assignment that everybody thinks it's going to be because of the way things unfold. Tell us a little bit about how the Fifth Corps and the Sixth Corps come about.
Sure. So in the time period in the aftermath of First Manassas, as George McClellan was spending months in the fall, winter, and early spring of 61 into 1862, there had been a disagreement between McClellan and the Lincoln administration about establishing a corps structure for the Army of the Potomac. Basically, both Lincoln and McClellan agreed that there should be a corps structure, that as the Army continued to grow, that this would be the only manageable way to manage such a large army would be to have trusted subordinates in charge of course, large corps structures under McClellan's command to wield this army and to move this army about. The process of doing that, though, was something that the Lincoln administration and McClellan disagreed with. The Lincoln administration wanted these corps to be formed before the Army of the Potomac moved from its camps around Washington and ultimately toward the peninsula in the spring of 1862, whereas McClellan wanted to move the army and then have it engage the enemy and then get a sense of who were the commanders that would be the right fit for corps command. And I think McClellan already had some people in mind for that. But ultimately, as it came about, um, sort of at McClellan's behest, McClellan had put forward to Lincoln a list of some of the officers that he believed would be ideal corps commanders for his army, but nonetheless, Lincoln just decided to basically appoint them right then and there. And I think that spoiled a little bit of the relationship that was already getting very spoiled between McClellan and Lincoln. And so McClellan did not get the corps commanders that he wanted. In particular, those that he wanted were, of course, Fitz John Porter and William Franklin. So it's in the midst of the Peninsula Campaign on May 18th, 1862, that the 5th and 6th Corps will be created out of pieces of the Army of the Potomac that had already existed. Of course, the 5th Corps would be given to Fitz John Porter, and the 6th Corps would be given to William Franklin. And this is something that's going to cause a lot of consternation in the Army of the Potomac, especially amongst the Army of the Potomac's high command. Lincoln himself is going to write McClellan that he viewed this as an effort to pamper one or two pets, namely Porter and McClellan. And Samuel Heintzelman, who was in charge of the Third Corps of the Army of the Potomac, wrote in his diary that of a trio of officers complaining to Heintzelman, he quipped that, quote, his name would have to be changed to Porter before he would be able to do anything in the Army of the Potomac itself. So this is really starting to put a strain on not only the relationship between the Lincoln administration and McClellan, but also Porter and his fellow officers in the Army of the Potomac, and in a larger sense in the Army as well, because somebody who's monitoring all of this was John Pope, who was furious that somebody who was his subordinate in terms of the dates of rank, Fitz John Porter would be promoted above him. And so Porter sort of gets on Pope's radar unintentionally because of all of this finagling that's going on with the Army of the Potomac's high command.
So, Kevin Donovan, this doesn't necessarily seem like a great place to be for Porter, although it seems like a great place to be. Like, hey, I'm command of a corps. How do you assess this spot that he's sitting in at this moment?
Well, he has the benefit of being a McClellan pet. So as long as McClellan is in power, he's in a pretty good spot. And as I think Kevin mentioned, he does well as Fifth Corps leader. At Gaines Mill, as you mentioned, he holds off Lee. Um, but and he does very well at Malvern Hill. But things, and I'm sure we're going to get to it, things change around August after McClellan is turned back at the gates of Richmond. And Lincoln administration has to decide, well, McClellan's been turned back. We have John Pope, by this time, has come east with a smaller army, and the Lincoln administration has to decide, okay, what is our strategy going forward? And the decision that is made has a very big impact on Porter personally.
So Kevin Pawlak, when John Pope comes to the East and he gets an army cobbled together for him, and he's got a lot of personnel issues there, and he's got some reservations, and he gets a bad rap for having his headquarters where his hindquarters should be. And so, I mean, things just aren't a smooth start for Pope when he gets here, and then Cedar Mountain kind of throws him back on his heels just a little bit. And so it seems to me it's a very tumultuous situation for Porter to suddenly find himself having to enter into during active campaigning with the Second Manassas campaign. Set the stage for us a little bit there. How does Porter end up in Pope's orbit, and how does that go?
So it's a very complicated story, and I've come to the conclusion in my studies of the Civil War that probably the Second Manassas campaign is maybe the most complicated campaign of the Civil War because of all the moving pieces that are involved in it. I think the Second Manassas campaign is a lot more than just what happens in northern and central Virginia in mid to late August of 1862. Of course, you have the political backdrop to that campaign as well. And when John Pope comes east and the Army of Virginia is officially created on June 26th, 1862, Chris, as you mentioned, Pope is ordered with cobbling together three disparate Union forces that had been throttled by Stonewall Jackson in the Shenandoah Valley earlier that year. Chris is excited about hearing
Woohoo!
that.
Yay!
And Pope is having to do all of this while trying to maintain relations and not just maintain relations, but build relations with politicians in Washington, D.C. So when Pope's Army of Virginia is created on June 26th, he will not take the field with that army until July 29th. So for the first month that the Army of Virginia is being put together, John Pope's not even around to put it together. So when he rides out to his army, it's very much something that is cobbled together and he's having to learn on the fly. Now, getting thrown into the midst of all this, again, John Pope takes the field on July 29th, 1862. A few days later, in early August, is when the Army of the Potomac, still under George McClellan's command about 20 miles southeast of Richmond at Harrison's Landing on the James River, will get orders to begin moving the army off the peninsula to join and link with Pope's army in central Virginia, somewhere around Culpeper or west of Fredericksburg. And Fitz John Porter's Fifth Corps will be the first to go from um, from Harrison's Landing, march down the peninsula to Fortress Monroe, get loaded up on boats, and sent up the Potomac River, and they'll get off the Potomac and make their way toward Pope's army. Now, it was already known by the time that Porter came into Pope's orbit that the two were not seeing eye to eye. As I mentioned previously, there was already some, I guess you could use the word jealousy amongst John Pope that Porter had received some of these earlier promotions during the Civil War. Also, of course, John Pope is going to come east. He's going to issue these orders, General Orders 5, 7, and 11, issue addresses to troops that take pretty blatant backhanded slaps at the operations of the Army of the Potomac. And this is famously where Fitz John Porter is going to refer to John Pope as an ass, and that's a direct quote. And that quote is going to make it back to John Pope. And so Pope is going to have that in his mind by the time Porter arrives and joins the Army of Virginia. One thing I do want to say, though, because Porter's correspondence is going to play such a key role in his downfall, but his correspondence was very much cherry picked during the court martial trial in late 1862 and early 1863. This is what Porter said just about a week before he actually joined John Pope's army. He wrote this to somebody that was looking to join his staff. He says, "Whoever rules makes no difference. Principles and not men should be our motto, and he who leads to victory is the one we want. Of course, I prefer McClellan to anyone," which of course was obvious, "but my loyalty to him does not debar me from giving all my efforts to anyone else. To crush the rebellion is my aim, and to do it effectively and soon is my earnest wish." So I think that's a very revealing letter from FitzJohn Porter that, of course, yes, he would prefer that McClellan is the one that's leading these armies, but despite his personal opinions of John Pope, he's not going to let those personal opinions get in the way of doing what is his ultimate duty, which had been his duty since he officially was mustered in and commissioned into the United States Army all the way back in 1845, 17 years earlier. So there's a lot of backstory to Porter joining Pope's army, but by the time Porter's Corps will arrive, and then I'll shut up and pass this on to you guys, then as you can see, I could talk about this stuff all day. But when Fitz John Porter and his corps, the Fifth Corps, arrive on the north bank of the Rappahannock River, they're immediately thrown into confusion because John Pope had not left them any orders about where to go. And so there is all sorts of confusion, not only within the portions of the Army of the Potomac joining Pope's command, but amongst Pope's commanders themselves about where was the rest of the army, what was the objective at this point of the campaign, where are we supposed to go. And so you're already getting a lot of confusion and a breakdown of communication between Pope and Porter, which is only going to worsen throughout the campaign.
A lot to unpack there. And Kevin Donovan, when Kevin Pawlak mentioned the cherry picking of the correspondence, I'm sure we'll get into that when we get into the trial stuff in a few minutes. But as Kevin has laid out all that backstory for us, what do you see as key moments there? What are some things that really jump out at you?
Well, the evacuation of the peninsula, as Kevin Pawlak mentioned, Porter is the first to go, and this because he marches so quickly to get up to Pope. He's marching down the peninsula. He's marching away from McClellan so quickly that McClellan actually sends an order, which I don't think Porter ever gets, saying, "Stop, slow down." But his apparent eagerness to go and support Pope becomes an issue at the trial. And we'll get into how the Judge Advocate General punctured that attempt by Porter to show, hey, I was anxious to go help my fellow general. But yes, there's a lot going on. I agree with Kevin Pawlak that when we get to the court-martial, there's going to be a lot of unfairness. And one aspect of that is, as Kevin put it, the cherry picking of these messages that Porter is sending. And provide a little more context, Porter is sending telegrams. That's what these messages are. He's sending telegrams because he has a working telegraph line when he gets up in the vicinity of Pope. His line, however, is going to Fredericksburg. General Burnside is there, and Burnside's a friend of Porter, and apparently Porter felt that he could, in the midst of giving military intelligence, unburden himself about what he thought about his situation, which he didn't like. And Kevin Pawlak quoted a telegram that makes Porter look, puts him in a good light. Oh, I don't care who I really report to, just as long as we're doing, the nation's work. Well, there's another one that comes out at the trial, and he says to Burnside, my birthday's coming up, August 31. Everybody should say, "Aw, my birthday is coming up." And then he says, my star always rises on my birthday. I hope that Mac's star is on the rise also. And that becomes a killer telegram used by the prosecution. We'll get into the theory, but that's evidence that Porter is trying to do whatever he can to elevate McClellan's career rather than his now commander, Pope. So a lot is going on as Porter is joining Pope. And these telegrams really crucify him in the end.
And it seems to me like the whole environment here is not like, hey, we all win if anybody wins. Like it's a zero-sum thing. Like McClellan can only look good if if Pope looks bad, and Pope can only look good if McClellan looks bad. And so it's not like they're rowing on the same boat in the same direction here.
No, and you throw in the mix, there's definitely a rivalry. Everybody knows it. And one of the issues is, okay, McClellan's army of the Potomac has been ordered off the peninsula to go north and effect a juncture with Pope's Army of Virginia, this cobbled together force. And both Pope and McClellan are sending messages to the newly appointed General-in-Chief Henry Halleck. And you know what they both want to know? Well, when the armies do combine, who's going to be in command? Now, Halleck is very clear. He writes to Pope, you will be. And he writes to McClellan, you will be.
Yeah, that is great clarity.
Very clear.
Yeah. And it strikes me too, like we know today from our perch in 2025 how Halleck's story plays out. But here, like he's brand new to his post. Everyone's thinking of him as the military genius, old brains. It has not yet been revealed that the guy is a first-rate clerk. And so, like, people are really counting on him
Yes.
to make all this work and come together. And he brings from the West with him essentially one of his pets, John Pope.
Yes.
Interesting, if you're a Grant fan, Halleck's not picking Grant as the winner. He's picking Pope is the winner to come to the East. So you've got all these really weird dynamics that are surrounding Halleck that I don't think a lot of people talk about when they talk about this controversy. Kevin Pawlak, anything you want to jump in on with that?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because so often in the literature about this time period in the Civil War, it is viewed as it's a two-lane road between John Pope and George McClellan. And I think you absolutely, to understand their relationship, you have to throw Henry Halleck into that equation as well. Because Halleck is, like Kevin mentioned, is going to be talking out both sides of his mouth to both Pope and McClellan about what's going to happen. And he's only going to create further confusion and fuel the rivalry between the two men because of what he's saying to each, which is not the truth of what he's saying to each because we don't know what the truth was of what would have happened once those two armies. Well, eventually we do, but that's only in the aftermath of Pope's defeat at Second Manassas. That of course McClellan will take command over Pope, but we don't know that at the time, and of course they didn't know that at the time. And so yes, to view the Pope and McClellan rivalry, you have to incorporate what Henry Halleck is doing as well to provide, I think, proper context to the story.
And I think
So,
we'll complicate it just a little bit more, and then Kevin Donovan, I'll let you chime in here. Like, Lincoln has some skepticism about Pope. I know the Pope's out, the Pope's at the Poops. I know the Pope's out west, and he's had a really contentious time with McClellan, and so he's really got to lean on his new General in Chief Halleck, who is untested at this point, and so it's really a confusing situation at the highest levels of command. Kevin Donovan, you wanted to add something in there a second ago.
yes, further context. The goal of the Lincoln administration at this point, we're talking about August, is to get the Army of the Potomac off the peninsula up to the vicinity of Washington or Culpeper and join it with Pope's army. So that's the goal. We're going to have one large army. Who commands it? Well, we'll see. And Lee's goal at this point is he knows what's going on. And as we'll see, his strategy is obvious: attack Pope's smaller army and destroy it before there can be a complete junction with the Army of the Potomac. And it becomes important later in this whole dispute. Why didn't the two armies cooperate? Because they clearly didn't.
So there is this lack of cooperation. There is this point of contention. Kevin Pollak, what does all of the hubbub turn out to be about? Why is there a controversy when all this finally settles?
Well, it's gosh, that's a no quick answer. I have written down in my notes somewhere, and let me just make sure I get the numbers right because I'm not a mathematician, but I want to get this right.
That's right.
So
We're
in
writers. Nobody said there'd be math
That's
involved.
right, exactly, thankfully. So in the aftermath, once Porter is finally cleared in 1886, which we're getting way ahead of the story, but the Porter court martial and trial and everything that takes place afterward, from 1862 to 1886, there are 3,028 pages of official testimony related to this. There are 393 books written about this. And when I had done this math back in August of 2021, on newspapers.com, from August 1862 to August 2021, I found 45,633 matches of Fitz John Porter's name on newspapers.com. So there's a lot to unpack here. But that being said, what I have always said is what Porter's trial and his 24 years of fighting to clear his name comes down to is one thing, and that's did his personal animosity of John Pope get in the way of him doing his official duty as a soldier of the United States Army? And I don't think it did. I'll be perfectly blunt and come out and say that. But what starts the problems that start, well, really, of course, it started well before Pope and Porter ever even met in Northern Virginia in late August of 1862, as we've discussed. But it starts that as Pope is trying to concentrate his army on Manassas Junction on the morning of August 28th, 1862, because he's proclaimed that he can bag the whole crowd, meaning that he can bag Jackson's portion of the Army of Northern Virginia that was split and divided from the other portion, the other half of the Army of Northern Virginia under James Longstreet, that Porter's going to be ordered up from the Rappahannock River to join Pope at Bristow Station the morning of August 28th. Now, Pope's orders to Porter were to be there by daylight, which would have meant that that Porter would have had to have left and started marching for Bristow Station about 1 a.m. the morning of August 28th. However, because of the nature of the roads, because it was an incredibly dark night, Porter decided, after conferring with some of his subordinate commanders, not to leave until several hours later, thinking that the roads would be clearer and that the roads might be clear, so they might get to Bristow Station the exact same time as they would have if they had left in the middle of the night when the roads were less clear and it was more dark. So that's one point of contention that already starts to boil over with Porter and Pope there on August 28th. Then, of course, as Pope is flailing around trying to figure out where Jackson's portion of the Confederate Army had gone, once Pope's army concentrated on Manassas Junction that morning of August 28th and found that Jackson was gone, Pope's going to spend the rest of the day of August 28th trying to find Jackson. Reports will tell him that Jackson's portion of the army has moved towards Centerville, and so initially he's going to order a concentration of the army on Centerville. Then he's going to get information, which is northeast of Manassas Junction on the other side of Bull Run. Then he's going to get information that instead Jackson's forces are closer toward Gainesville, which is just under a dozen miles west of Centerville on the other side of Bull Run. So he's going to order a concentration of his army on Gainesville. Then he's going to realize later on in the afternoon of August 28th that reports indicate that Jackson's portion of the army has gone towards Centerville. So he's going to order his army to start marching towards Centerville. And in the process of doing this, portions of his army will march right across Jackson's front on the evening of August 28th, and that's when Jackson is going to bring out his portions of the army, or at least a small portion of his army, to engage Rufus King's division in what becomes known as the Battle of Brawner Farm on the evening of August 28th. Now, we're not going to get into that at all, but in terms of how it ties into Pope and Porter, the Federal Division under Rufus King is going to suffer some pretty heavy casualties, including John Gibbon's Black Hat Brigade. And but in the process, what they're going to do is, of course, discover, or at least Stonewall Jackson will reveal himself to Pope as to his location. And so Pope's going to order a concentration of his army south of Jackson's position and north of Manassas Junction for the morning of August 29th. And what he hoped was that Rufus King's division would maintain its position near the right flank of Jackson's line. King, that night, after recovering from an epileptic seizure and having spoken with his subordinate commanders, had decided that they were in a vulnerable position, and so they pulled away from Jackson's line. And so now, in John Pope's eyes, there was not a force to engage Jackson's right, and not just to engage Jackson's right, but to block the junction of James Longstreet's portion of the army joining Stonewall Jackson's portion of the army at Second Manassas. And so Pope is going to turn to Porter and Irvin McDowell to lead their forces from Manassas toward Gainesville on the morning of August 29th to be the sledgehammer blow against the right end of Jackson's line, while Pope is keeping the left end of Jackson's line busy with smaller attacks throughout the day on August 29th.
So that's a lot that goes on. Porter has been riding high up to this moment. Oops. Kevin Donovan, when does this other shoe fall for Porter?
Okay, so we're going to get beyond the battle then, right? Okay, so yes. Well, Pope loses the battle. And his army is streaming back to Washington in a rout. And he already is, before he even gets to Washington, he's complaining that he has not gotten the support and cooperation of the Army of the Potomac officers, and he focuses on Porter. When he gets back to Washington, and he's now been relieved of command, and his rival, McClellan, has taken over, where McClellan has won the great rivalry, and that does not put Pope in a good mood. And he meets with Lincoln, who helpfully, either Lincoln or Stanton, helpfully pours gasoline on Pope's smoldering temper by saying, "Oh, have you seen these telegrams that Porter was sending, disparaging you and basically calling you an idiot? Jackson's running rings around you."
Whoops.
Oops. Um, won't go into detail, but Pope has already decided that he has been stabbed in the back by the McClellan clique. He has already started focusing on Porter, but he just goes ballistic and he wants charges filed against Porter. Porter is actually relieved of command temporarily at that point by Lincoln's hand. But McClellan says, as he's going off to fight what becomes Antietam, I have to have this experienced commander. So he gets reinstated, but then after the Battle of Antietam, jump forward, the elections are held. Lincoln, after the elections, decides it's time to relieve McClellan. And at the very same time, he relieves and places under arrest Fitz John Porter. And a court of inquiry, not a court martial yet, a court of inquiry is established to look into charges brought against Porter by Pope, because Pope is focused on Porter as the scapegoat. He deliberately, according to Pope, he deliberately withheld his cooperation, and that caused the loss of the battle. That court of inquiry subsequently turns into the court martial, and we can go through the charges, but that's how we get from A to B. It's Pope with an interesting little shove by Lincoln, which is interesting.
I'm going to have you flesh that out just a little bit with the charges. Kevin, I want to take a quick little detour into what if land for a second, because Kevin Donovan mentions that, going into Antietam, McClellan says, I've got to have this guy. His experience, he's a hard fighter. Porter gets reinstated only to sit with his reserves and then not get into the fight. And so, like, had Antietam turned out differently, would all these subsequent events and questions about Porter have turned out differently?
Oh gosh.
I mean, it's ultimately an unanswerable question, but it just
Yes,
always seems to me
yeah.
like victory excuses a lot of things and defeat amplifies a lot of things.
Yes, I think certainly they may have, and almost immediately in the aftermath of Antietam, there is a story that goes around. Well, this will be decades later, but even then, I think stories were starting to rumble that yes, Porter's Corps is sitting in the middle of the Army of the Potomac, on the east side of Antietam Creek, where the Confederate Army's on the west side of the creek, and that Porter's Corps is not ultimately engaged. They will be engaged in some numbers, but not in any large, serious enough numbers. What's interesting about that, though, what we do know, this is at least according to Porter, and I've always said when it comes to Lincoln's visit to the Army of the Potomac in early October 1862, you really have to read things with a grain of salt, because depending on whether you read George McClellan's accounts or Abraham Lincoln's accounts, the two of them, I'm surprised. I think the only evidence we have that they ever met is through photography, and they may not have even said a single word to each other during that, because McClellan thinks that he gets everything he wants out of those meetings, and Lincoln thinks he gets everything he wants from McClellan out of those meetings. So take this all with a grain of salt, but at least what FitzJohn Porter wrote after the war is that we know that he spoke with President Lincoln during his visit and review of the Fifth Corps on October 2nd, 1862. And of course, there's the famous photograph taken of Lincoln and McClellan surrounded by many staff officers and other officers of the Army of the Potomac, including Porter. But anyway, what Porter had heard from Lincoln, or what Lincoln told him, was that Lincoln was actually pleased with Porter's performance during the Second Manassas campaign and the Maryland campaign, despite the fact that Lincoln already knew that charges had been brought against Porter, this court of inquiry, which I'm not convinced Porter knew about, but that Lincoln certainly knew about, had been brought against him, and so um, don't quite know where I'm going with this, but it's just more, throwing more onto this very confusing story of it's a he said type thing, but of course ultimately um, Porter's head is going to be thrown on a silver platter, and Lincoln is not going to, despite what he supposedly told Porter in October 1862, Lincoln's not going to stand in the way of that happening. Um, but I certainly do think that Porter's performance was something. It's hard to say in the Maryland campaign because again his corps is not heavily engaged, or at least that seriously engaged during the course of the fighting on September 17th. But I think his performance wasn't bad either by any stretch of the imagination, which, of course, depending on your viewpoint, you could view his performance as bad during the Second Manassas campaign if you're in John Pope's camp.
So, Kevin Donovan, these charges get filed. What does the case against Fitz John Porter look like?
On December 1, 1862, that's when Porter finds out, the first substantive day of the trial, he finds out what the charges are against him. I can summarize them as follows. Basically, group charge 1, disobedience of orders. Specifically, Kevin mentioned the night march. He was ordered to march so that he would get to Pope by daylight on the 28th. The order was actually very specific. He was ordered to march, commencing at 1 a.m. And as Kevin mentioned, he decided he would wait. So there's no question he disobeyed that order. And he didn't get to Pope by daybreak. That's one. Second, as we briefly discussed, Pope's plan for the first day of the battle, August 29, is that he's expecting Porter and McDowell to jump on Jackson's right flank. There was another order. It goes down in history as the so-called joint order. It's very confusing, but the bottom line is Pope thought in his mind it was an order for Porter and McDowell, but especially Porter, to attack Jackson's supposedly exposed right flank. Porter didn't attack. Later on the 29th, around 4:30, supposedly, Pope issues another order. This one is very explicit. It tells Porter to attack. It specifically says your line of march brings you in on Jackson's flank, attack his flank, and if possible, his rear. Again, Porter doesn't attack. Pope, who by this time is angry, issues a peremptory order that evening. Upon receipt of this order, march your whole command and join me on the battlefield. Porter disobeys that order also, to the extent through some sloppy staff work, 2 of his brigades take a wrong turn. And then there's a second basic charge, and that is misconduct in the face of the enemy. And the theory there is, even if you hadn't been ordered to attack, you were obligated as an officer to pitch in because you knew that your commanding officer on another part of the field was engaged in battle and needed your help. There are more specifics, but that's basically it. We've got a series of orders, primarily to attack. Porter didn't attack. And even without orders, he should have attacked. And I'll quickly say, an attorney is always looking for, a prosecutor is always looking for a motive. Why would Porter disobey these orders? Why wouldn't he support Pope? Why did he sit on his hands, supposedly, when there was a golden opportunity? And the theory goes back to those darn telegrams. The Judge Advocate General has the telegrams where Porter is disparaging Pope and hoping for basically the return of McClellan. And the theory of the prosecution is that Porter deliberately withheld support from Pope because he wanted Pope to lose the battle. That's treason. And that's why his life was at risk, and that's real risk at this proceeding.
Oh, that's right. Because if you're convicted of treason, that's the death sentence, right? Yeah. So, counselor, as an attorney, let me ask you to put your attorney hat on here. Are these charges legit? Are they trumped up? Is there a case here, or is this really just an excuse to go after McClellan?
Yes.
Well, that was a fantastic answer.
Are they legitimate in the sense of, did Porter disobey orders? He did disobey some orders, but then he has a defense. But did he disobey orders? Was he ordered to attack by the 4:30 order? Yes. Did he attack? No. So he disobeyed the order. But again, we'll get into his defense, but they're legitimate in the sense that technically he violated orders. Now, does he have a defense? Yes, we'll get into that. Your third question, is this simply a way to get at McClellan? I don't know what Kevin Pawlak would say, but I I think so. I think so.
That might be
Uh,
the $1 million question for tonight. Maybe we can put that off to the end if you want to, because I think that we're circling the drain on a really big question there.
but I will add one thing though, very briefly. I come back to Lincoln. There is evidence that Lincoln did believe that Porter was guilty. He had a conversation with Senator Orville Browning right before the trial started. And Browning said, I've been hearing rumors that the high command of the Army of the Potomac deliberately failed to support Pope. And according to Browning's journal, Lincoln replied that he didn't think that that was true, except in the case of Fitz John Porter. And he said, I hope that upon investigation, my suspicion will be proved groundless, but I fear it is so. So
Yeah.
Lincoln has some concerns.
A lot of layers there.
There's an awful lot of the battle was complicated, the campaign was complicated, and the Fitz John Porter trial was super complicated.
Right. It merits its own book in the ORs. It has its own volume.
Absolutely.
So. Mr. Pollock, what do you think about those charges?
I think Kevin brought up some excellent points that there are definitely charges that that are legitimate against Porter. Now, in Porter's mind, and the way his defense was crafted, is that he did have grounds to stand on as to why those orders were disobeyed in some cases. And it's even interesting to note that one of the charges that was originally filed against Porter actually got thrown out, and that was that essentially that Porter did not even well, one of those charges was that Porter did not attack on August 30th, which of course is completely bogus, because it was the largest federal attack of the entire battle was headed by Fitz John Porter on August 30th, and it was some of the most intense fighting of the entire battle. Um, but Porter felt that he had grounds to stand on, and some of the testimony was brought out both in 1862 and early 1863, and then again in 1879 or 1878 with the Schofield Board, bears that out as well. Now, in terms of the orders on August 28th to move toward Bristow Station, those are orders, as Kevin mentioned, that Porter did disobey. Of course, he did not completely disobey them in the sense that he just never marched his command to Bristow Station. He just did not follow it to the letter of the law as Pope spelled out. The August 29th attack orders are a bit more difficult to make some sense out of. Firstly, the 4:30 p.m. order that was issued to Porter is definitely true, but it wasn't until 20 years after the fact that the man who carried those orders from Pope to Porter, who had just so happened to be John Pope's nephew, remembered that he got lost on the way to bring the orders to Porter, and so by the time the orders reached Porter, it was 6:30 p.m. on the evening of August 29th. It was very late in the day, and Porter believed it was too late to attack. And so that's part of the reason why he did not attack there. The earlier attack orders that, as I mentioned, when Porter and McDowell are going to be sent northwest from Manassas Junction, searching for Porter's right, or excuse me, for Jackson's right. I do just want to read a couple of snippets from that order that becomes known as the joint order, and I've always used this giving tours of the Battle of Second Manassas, and told people, if you are a CEO of a company or if you are a leader, this is not how you write an email to your employees telling them what to do. Because in Pope's mind, the intention of Pope's orders is, with, no bars hold, attack Jackson's right. Here's what this order says: you will please move forward with your joint commands. This is written to both McDowell and Porter, toward Gainesville. It says nothing about going to Gainesville. It just says moving in that direction. And then moving on a little bit, it says, I desire that as soon as communication is established between this force and the rest of the army, your command shall halt. Again, no word of attack. It may be necessary to fall back behind Bull Run at Centerville tonight. If any considerable advantages are to be gained by departing from this order, it will not be strictly carried out. One thing must be had in view, that the troops must occupy a position from which they can reach Bull Run tonight or by tomorrow morning. So again, that's just snippets of that joint order, but there's never the word attack spelled out, and never again move to Jackson's right. It's just move toward Jackson's right. But don't get too far away from the rest of the army, because we may have to pull back behind Bull Run tonight. And once you've established communications with the rest of the army, the order is not attack, it's halt. So there's all sorts of confusion, I'm sure, in Porter's mind about what is this order really telling me to do. And the same with Irvin McDowell. So these were the grounds that Porter felt he had to stand on, is that these orders were not explicit about what exactly he was supposed to do. But ultimately, that's not going to matter, the way that the trial was constructed against Porter in late 1862 and early 1863 as well. I mean, three of the judges, or three of the generals sitting on the court martial, two of them, James Ricketts and Rufus King, themselves had some heat coming their way, that they might have been at fault for the defeat at Second Manassas. So of course it's going to be very convenient for them to say, well, don't look at me, look at this guy on trial, right? Um, and then also Silas Casey, who had a run-in with Fitz John Porter about command of the Pennsylvania Reserve, so he certainly had no love lost for Fitz John Porter as well. He was another one of those generals that was on the court martial. So despite some evidence, looking back on it years from now, or years later, that seemed to support Porter and what he was trying to argue. A lot of Porter's arguments were simply thrown out the window, and the court, of course, ultimately sided with Pope.
And it always has struck me that there's a basic inconsistency in the charges against Porter, because like the first one is, you didn't leave when you were exactly ordered to leave, but then later is the, well, you didn't have orders, but you should have still done this. So like, is he supposed to follow the letter of the law, or is he supposed to use independent judgment? Which I think most of us would agree that like your commander should have discretion to be able to, based on what's going on the ground in front of him, make some decisions about what's best or what's not. And so like Porter's damned if he does and damned if he doesn't, based on these particular charges, it seems to me.
That was the point.
Counselor Donovan, Kevin laid out a little bit for us about the folks, the officers who were on the court martial. Tell us your impression of the setup of the trial. Is this even set up for Porter to get a fair shake?
No, no. Every Stanton, Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, at this point has thrown in his lot with the so-called radical Republicans who hate McClellan. And every member of that court, there were 9 of them, was either a radical or had a motive, as Kevin Pawlak pointed out, to throw blame on Porter, or had some other incentive. Stanton actually lobbied a couple of them before the trial started so that they knew what he wanted. It was a hanging court to begin with. David Hunter was the presiding judge. So, and as the trial goes forward, we can see how that unfairness came through. I'll just touch on one point. First day of the trial, December 1, charges are read. December 3, they come back. Porter's asked, how do you plead? In response, his counsel make a motion to dissolve the court because when an army, the Articles of War say, if an army commander is bringing charges, the court has to be convened by order of the President of the United States. This one wasn't. It was convened by order of Halleck. And I won't go into the details, but there's a back and forth between Porter's counsel and the Judge Advocate General, a fellow named Joseph Holt, who's new to the role. Stanton got him his job. And they go back and forth on who's actually bringing the charges, because Porter's counsel, I'm sure, as a lawyer, they wanted it on the record that Pope's bringing the charges, because any trial lawyer will tell you if you can show that a witness has a bias, an interest in the outcome, it's easier to attack his credibility. And one of the things they point to is that court of inquiry that I mentioned. Halleck had signed an order saying the purpose of the court of inquiry is to have to look into charges brought by General Pope against Porter. Pretty clear evidence, except the court decides, well, no, they were technically signed by General Benjamin Roberts, who happened to be on Pope's staff. So technically, Pope is not bringing the motion denied. So that's, from the start, if you're Porter and his counsel, you're thinking, we may be having a problem with this court.
So how does the trial go, and how does Porter try to navigate that?
His counsel obviously, Judge Advocate General goes first. His counsel, Reverend D. Johnson, who's a well-known name in Civil War circles, former U.S. Attorney General, soon to be a U.S. Senator from Maryland, and John Ames, who was also a nationally known trial lawyer. They do a pretty good job. We don't have time to go into the details, but they absolutely skewer Pope on cross-examination, and they make a fool out of him. But there are a couple points of the cross-examination of Pope when they really have Pope on the ropes and they're waiting for the killer answer. The court keeps stepping in and saying, oh, no, that's not a proper question, or, oh, no, we may have to adjourn now, or just something else. So that's one of the unfairnesses. Witnesses who are adverse to Porter are allowed to give their opinions. Oh, if only Pope had attacked, or if only Porter had attacked, we would have bagged Jackson. If only Porter had done this, we would have been in great shape. And then when Porter's counsel asked a question that I don't think called for an opinion, but somebody on the court said that calls for an opinion. Well, you've been letting opinion in right and left. And they say, oh, no, we're not allowing opinion testimony in this proceeding, period. End of story. Okay, now we know the rules. Very next witness, Holton calls. Ask him a question. What in your judgment would have happened if this? Objection, opinion. And no, we'll hear it. I mean, come on. There are many examples. Witnesses adverse to Porter were allowed to speculate about what was going on in Porter's mind. One of them said that I told General Pope that I was so certain that Fitz John Porter was a traitor, I would shoot him that night, as far as any crime against heaven were concerned. And then the final blow is one of Porter's staff testifies, very effective testimony, that he delivered a message to General King. And after he delivered the message, General McDowell, who happened to be with King, gave this staff officer, Colonel Locke, a message to take back to Porter. And it said, give my compliments to General Porter. Tell him I think he had better stay where he is, but if he needs to fall back, he can do so on my left. Which is critical because McDowell outranks Porter, and that message, while polite, is an order: stay where you are, don't attack. That was the key to dispelling the sting of much of the charges. So Holt knows they have to destroy Locke's credibility. So what he does is McDowell is kind of wishy-washy in saying, "Oh, I don't remember that happening." But Holt thinks, "Oh, General King was there." Well, where's King at this point? He's on the court. So Holt says, "Come on down." Turns him into a fact witness, and King, who, as you and Kevin pointed out, King has an incentive to shift blame to Porter. King testifies, "Locke, I never saw that guy before in my life. And there was no order from McDowell." And that was crushing. That was crushing. So to say there was a fair trial, I don't want to get into politics, what somebody else would say. But in this instance, to say it was a fair trial, Porter's counsel, although I do have some criticism of them in some respects, as you know, as a hindsight-looking lawyer, they did a very good job, but the deck was stacked against them, clearly. The only good news for Porter is they didn't vote to execute him.
Okay. Mr. Pawlak, your thoughts about the trial?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, so I will definitely defer to what Kevin says, but I would absolutely agree with him that it seems that the cards were stacked against Porter, and that regardless of any evidence that Porter tried to bring onto the trial or his counsel tried to bring onto the trial, that there was no way that Porter was getting out of this. It was just a matter of what degree would he ultimately be found guilty, and of course cashiered from the army, which is what happened to him on January 21st, 1863.
January 21st, Stonewall Jackson's birthday, by the way. I'll just point that
Always a
out.
Jackson connection.
Got to get that worked back in. So counselor, what are the ramifications of this trial?
I'll be first. Well, poor FitzJohn, his army career obviously is destroyed. He spends the next 26, 27 years begging for a new hearing. Virtually every president. He finally gets the ear of President Hayes, who convenes a board, a three officer board. In 1878, they hear new testimony. They take a fresh look at the case. Curiously, a key witness will not appear. John Pope absolutely refuses to appear, probably because he knows he's really going to get skewered this time. And in 1879, they issue a report exonerating Porter of all the serious charges. The only thing they say is you really should not have sent those telegrams disparaging your superior officer. That was unprofessional. It takes, let's see, that's 1879. It takes another, 7 years, Kevin, I think, before Congress passes a special act reinstating Porter to the Army without back pay. He had to give that up as part of the political arguing. And but by all accounts, he although he fought hard for the rest of his life, by all accounts, he was crushed by this. One of his early biographers was talking to his daughter, who said that, describes his life and said that after the trial, for all that time, I never saw my father smile, which is terrible. More broadly, and I think Kevin Pawlak maybe can address this more than I speculate that it was a warning shot to other generals that you better get in line with our program, and otherwise you will be crushed too.
Yeah, Mr. Pawlak, thoughts on that?
Yeah, there's a letter that I think says it all that Henry Halleck wrote to Horatio Wright on August 25th, 1862. And I think this pretty much sums up the sentiments of trying to deal with dissenting generals in the Federal Army at this point. Halleck said the government seems determined to apply the guillotine to all unsuccessful generals. It seems rather hard to do this where the general is not in fault, but perhaps with us now, as in the French Revolution, some harsh measures are required. So I think that pretty much says it all right there. In terms of Porter, I absolutely agree with Kevin, and I love the quotes and the interviews from Otto Eisenschimmel of Porter's daughter talking about Porter. And one of the quotes that really sticks with me is that his daughter, Porter's daughter, referred to her father as a seared soul after all of this. That, Porter really just poured his heart and soul into having his name corrected. And she talked about that basically the only time she would see him was during dinner. He would talk not much at all. He might play a game of chess with one of her brothers, and then he'd be up in his office most of the evening writing letters and campaigning for his name to be cleared. And this, Fitz John Porter became a political pinata from 1862 all the way till 1886 and even beyond in many cases. And so it was a very hard fight for Porter, and it really I think claimed his soul. I mean, one case in point of that, his birthday is August 31st. Of course, the Battle of Second Manassas, which is going to be the battle that really brings Porter trouble, ends on August 30th, 1862. So for the rest of his life, Porter really never celebrated his birthday on August 31st. Instead, he sort of celebrated it instead on July 1st, which is the anniversary of the Battle of Malvern Hill. So I think it really just goes to show how crushed Porter was personally, not just professionally, but personally, from what happened to him in late 1862 and early 1863.
And I think again, if we widen our lens a little bit more too, and sort of look at the grander timeline where Lincoln visits the army in October and everything seems to be okay, when they have those meetings, and then by November, McClellan is removed from command. After the elections are over, and then that's when machinations start against Porter, who then goes on to trial in December. And it almost seems to me like McClellan gets removed, and in order to kind of make that stick or to justify that, the effort against Porter is really kind of a proxy battle about McClellan. And if we can discredit Porter, that'll stick and sort of maybe help us prove why McClellan's removal was a worthwhile thing. And I don't know what sort of evidence might be laid out for that, but just the timing of all that seems really suspicious to me.
And not just having to stick to McClellan, but having it stick to McClellan's way of war
You know.
as well, a conservative way of war, which of course was not necessarily on its way out, but was certainly not the way that the war should be prosecuted in the mind of the Lincoln administration at that time, which of course Porter was a adamant proponent of the conservative way of war, of McClellan's way of war, and that way of war was being pushed out of the Lincoln administration by that time period as well.
So, Mr. Donovan, what would you say for modern Civil War audiences? What's a takeaway from the trial of Fitz John Porter?
Always protect your rear. I think it's a very good illustration of the backbiting, the politics that seemed always to be in play in Washington and in the armies. The rivalry of McClellan and Pope, and as Kevin said, McClellan represented the conservative way of fighting war, definitely against emancipation, definitely against what we call hard war. And Pope was a darling of the radicals, and there was a clash, and there was politics. And I think Porter didn't realize that. And I think he was naive. Certainly putting things in writing that he put in writing shows that he was naive. As a former employment lawyer, In the age of email, I can tell you we still have clients, or did have clients. Why did you put that in an email? Porter would be, in certain respects, would be the nightmare client. But I come back to, I think he was naive. I think if what he did, what he said, if it had happened at a different point in the war, maybe he could have survived. But the politics of the time were changing. He was a McClellan protege, and in that sense, he backed the wrong horse, and he did not survive.
Mr. Pawlak, from your perspective, what's a takeaway for modern Civil War audiences of the trial of Fitz John Porter?
I'll take a more personal look at it, and admittedly, one I've always admired Fitz John Porter, but one thing that the more and more I've studied about this piece of his life, which of course is a huge piece of his life, is that this was a guy that dedicated his life to the service of his country. He graduated from West Point in 1845, and he was served dutifully in the Army all the way until 1862, and he had all of that pretty unfairly stripped away from him. And the thing that I admire about Porter is he lost everything that was dear to him from a professional standpoint, and he very easily could have just faded off into the darkness and not done anything about it. But he seared his soul, and for the next 24 years spent every waking minute of his life fighting to have what he viewed as wrongs corrected. And I think whether you are a supporter of FitzJohn Porter in his case or not, I think that's something that's admirable, is that this guy again had everything taken away from him, and he didn't let that he didn't just sit down and take it. He fought back to have his name cleared because of what he thought was wrong. So I think that's an amazing trait that Porter demonstrates.
Yeah. Let me
Agreed.
just have you continue here for a second, Kevin, before I sort of turn over to Mr. Donovan to ramp up. Um, for modern Civil War students who want to go walk the battlefield at Second Manassas and kind of see what Porter saw and kind of look at the battle through his perspectives, you do a lot of battlefield tours at Second Manassas. Where can people go to kind of walk in the footsteps of this history?
So there's really, well, three places that you can go that relate to Porter in his trial. One is Bristow Station, Battlefield Heritage Park, which is a site managed by Prince William County that I have the honor of working at.
I was going to say
Um,
managed by me. That's fine.
Yes, managed by me, yeah.
Sure.
But that's where Porter's downfall really starts. Again, that's the first, at least chronologically, the first charge that's leveled against Porter by Pope is that Porter does not arrive at Bristow Station in time to support Pope. Another piece is it's now unfortunately basically data center alley and warehouse alley, but you can still drive much of the route that Porter's Corps took on August 29th from Manassas Junction toward Gainesville. It was the Manassas Gainesville Road at the time. Today it is Wellington Road. It doesn't exactly follow all the way from Manassas to Gainesville, the route that Porter's Corps took, but there is a small historical marker just on the northwest side of the Prince William Parkway at Dawkins Branch that talks about Porter and his trial that comes as a result of him not attacking across Dawkins Branch on August 29th. So again, not great from a historical perspective in the sense that it's not a preserved piece of the battlefield that you can walk. But I still always enjoy visiting that spot. And then lastly, my favorite spot, bar none, on the Second Manassas battlefield is the Deep Cut area, which is the location of Porter's attack on August 30th. It's beautifully preserved, and even though Manassas battlefield is a 5,000 acre oasis, away from the development of Northern Virginia. I mean, this is really a section of the battlefield where you see no modern structures at all. And you can really get a sense of this attack. And I always kind of stand there and think, well, geez, if Porter didn't want to support Pope, he had every reason to look across that open field and say, no, I'm not sending my guys across that. And he did. But to be able to walk that where some of the most desperate fighting of the Second Manassas battle took place is easily one of my favorite places to go on any Civil War battlefield, to walk in the footsteps of those Federal soldiers as they made their way up toward the deep cut.
And Mr. Donovan, I'll sort of give you our final word. You go out and you give talks about the trial of Fitz John Porter. So if folks are interested in having Kevin come to your roundtable, for instance, he's got a great program about this. What is it about this story that resonates so strongly with you on a personal level?
It's the intersection of two things I love, and that's and that's the law and the Civil War. And it was this goes back years when I was in a used bookstore and I found an original, 1880s copy of the transcript. And the opportunity to read an 1862-63 court martial and then think about it, and that's got me off to the races. And I love the analysis. I love the fact that it's Civil War, and there's still more to learn about Porter. But I do want to add that I absolutely agree with Kevin Pawlak. Porter could have laid down and died, and he didn't. And regardless of what you think of him, of his performance, and whether he was a great general or a mediocre general, or naive, the fact that he did fight for the rest of his life to clear his name, not only for himself, I suspect, but for his family, that's admirable. So I think he's a very fascinating character.
Well, you've both given us lots to think about today, and I hope that our listeners and our viewers spend some time looking at this aspect of the story with the anniversary of Second Manassas upon us. There are repercussions and resonances from that battle well beyond the battlefield, as you guys have pointed out for us tonight. Kevin and Kevin, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
So I'm Chris Bukowski for the Emerging Civil War podcast. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.